April 1945. The Thousand-Year Reich was crumbling. From the east, 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, the Red Army, stood ready to deliver the final, brutal judgment. Their target, the capital of the collapsing Third Reich. Today, we witness the ultimate siege. A battle waged street by street, bunker by bunker, as fanaticism met overwhelming power. The war was already lost, but the fight for the Führerbunker and the Reichstag would be the bloodiest confrontation of all. This is the end of the line. This is the Battle of Berlin. In the spring of 1945, as the apple trees bloomed across war-torn Europe, the Third Reich, which Adolf Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, stood on the brink of final collapse. From the west, American, British, Canadian, and French armies were crossing the Rhine and driving deep into Germany. From the south, Allied forces were pushing through northern Italy. And from the east, the colossal might of the Red Army, hardened by 4 years of the most brutal warfare in human history, was poised for the final strike. The target was Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany, the seat of Hitler's power, the city from which the orders for conquest and genocide had emanated. And in mid-April 1945, over 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, prepared to storm the city in what would become the climactic battle of the war in Europe. This is the story of the Battle of Berlin, the apocalyptic final battle that would reduce a great city to rubble, claim hundreds of thousands of lives, and mark the end of the deadliest conflict in human history. By April 1945, Germany was defeated in all but name. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble in the West, had failed catastrophically. The Rhine had been crossed. The Ruhr industrial region, the heart of German war production, was encircled. German forces in the West were retreating or surrendering en masse. The Western Allies were less than 200 miles from Berlin. But it was from the east that the mortal blow would come. The Red Army, after 4 years of continuous combat, after liberating Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and pushing through eastern Germany, now stood along the Oder and Neisse rivers, just 40 miles east of Berlin. And the two Soviet commanders preparing the final assault were locked in an intense rivalry for the honor of capturing the Nazi capital. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most celebrated commander, victor of Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk, commanded the first Belarusian front positioned directly east of Berlin. Zhukov had been promised by Stalin the honor of taking Berlin, and he was determined to fulfill that promise. His forces, over 900,000 men, 3,000 tanks, and 16,000 artillery pieces, were assembled for a direct assault from the east. To the south stood Zhukov's rival, Marshal Ivan Koniev, commanding the First Ukrainian Front. Koniev resented that Zhukov had been given pride of place for the Berlin operation. His forces, equally massive, equally determined, were positioned to attack from the south, theoretically supporting Zhukov but secretly hoping to reach Berlin first. Stalin, with characteristic cunning, had deliberately fostered this rivalry. He drew the boundary between the two fronts stopping short of Berlin, telling each marshal that whoever reached the city first could take it. The result was a race, not just against the Germans but against each other, that would drive the Soviet advance forward with relentless speed regardless of casualties. In Berlin, deep beneath the Reich Chancellery in a concrete bunker 50 feet underground, Adolf Hitler presided over the final days of his Thousand-Year Reich. The Führerbunker, as it was known, had become Hitler's tomb while he still lived, a claustrophobic complex of rooms where Hitler, his mistress Eva Braun, and a handful of loyal staff endured the constant vibration of Soviet artillery shells and the approach of inevitable defeat. Hitler, at 56, was a physical wreck. His left hand trembled uncontrollably, possibly from Parkinson's disease, possibly from stress. His back was stooped. He shuffled when he walked. He raged at maps showing phantom armies, issuing orders to divisions that no longer existed, commanding counterattacks from forces that had been destroyed weeks earlier. But Hitler refused to leave Berlin. He refused to surrender. He refused to accept reality. He blamed everyone, his generals for betraying him, the German people for proving unworthy of his vision, the Jews for existing. But he would not admit that his own decisions, his own strategic blunders, his own refusal to accept military reality had brought Germany to this catastrophic end. And so he ordered Berlin defended to the last man, to the last bullet, to the last breath. The city would become a fortress, and its defenders would be whoever was left. The defense of Berlin was a desperate, pathetic endeavor. The Wehrmacht, once the most powerful military machine in the world, had been shattered. What remained were fragments, exhausted divisions retreating from the Oder, scratch units formed from stragglers, SS formations still fanatically loyal to Hitler. But the bulk of Berlin's defenders were not professional soldiers. They were the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, men between 16 and 60 who had been conscripted in the last months of the war. Many were elderly, veterans of the First World War recalled for one last battle. Many were boys, the Hitler Youth, some as young as 12, given Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and told to stop Soviet tanks. These defenders had inadequate training, inadequate weapons, and no hope of victory. Many understood this. Some deserted when they could. Others fought because fleeing meant execution by SS squads enforcing Hitler's orders that deserters be hanged from lampposts as examples. Still others fought from genuine fanaticism, believing Nazi propaganda that promised miracle weapons would save Germany, or from fear of Soviet retribution for what Germany had done in the Soviet Union. The defense of Berlin was organized into sectors, with improvised fortifications, anti-tank ditches, barricades, buildings converted into strongpoints. But there was no coordinated plan, no strategic depth, no mobile reserves. It was a defense designed to die in place, to extract whatever cost it could from the attackers before being overwhelmed. By mid-April, Soviet forces had completed their preparations. Vast ammunition dumps were established behind the lines. Artillery was registered on German positions. Assault troops moved into jumping-off positions. The air was thick with tension. Everyone, Soviet soldiers, German defenders, Berlin civilians huddled in cellars, knew what was coming. The bombardment. The assault. The end. In Moscow, Stalin urged his marshals to move quickly. Intelligence suggested the Western Allies might attempt to reach Berlin first, despite an agreement that Berlin would be in the Soviet zone of occupation. Stalin wanted the Red Army to take Berlin before any Western forces arrived, to establish Soviet dominance over the German capital and to exact revenge for the 27 million Soviet citizens who had died in the war Germany had started. At precisely 5 a.m. on April 16, 1945, Marshal Zhukov's artillery opened fire. But this was not merely an artillery barrage. This was the greatest concentration of firepower ever assembled on a single battlefield. Over 16,000 artillery pieces and mortars, one gun for every 13 feet of front, fired simultaneously along a 20-mile front. The noise was beyond comprehension. Men 50 miles away reported the ground shaking beneath their feet. The flash of muzzle fire lit the pre-dawn sky like continuous lightning. For 30 minutes, shells fell on German positions at a rate of thousands per minute. Everything in the target zone, trenches, bunkers, towns, forests, was pulverized. But Zhukov had prepared a theatrical element to amplify the psychological impact. As the barrage lifted at 5:30 a.m. and Soviet infantry prepared to attack, 143 searchlights, anti-aircraft lights positioned behind Soviet lines, suddenly illuminated, their beams pointing toward German positions. The intention was to blind German defenders, to create shock and confusion, to make the battlefield as bright as day. It didn't work as planned. The lights reflected off the smoke and dust from the bombardment, creating a fog that obscured visibility for attackers and defenders alike. And the lights made perfect aiming points for German artillery that had survived the bombardment. But the psychological effect was real. German defenders spoke afterward of the terror of seeing thousands of Soviet troops advancing out of the artificial dawn, shouting "Hurrah! Hurrah!" as they charged. But Zhukov's forces did not break through immediately. Between the Oder River and Berlin stood a formidable natural obstacle, the Seelow Heights, a plateau rising 150 feet above the surrounding terrain. German forces, under General Gotthard Heinrici, one of Germany's ablest defensive commanders, had fortified this position with multiple defensive lines, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and artillery registered on every approach. Heinrici had also anticipated Zhukov's bombardment. He withdrew most of his forces from the front line just before it began, leaving only a thin screen of troops. The massive Soviet barrage thus fell on largely empty positions. When Soviet infantry and armor attacked, they encountered the main German defensive line relatively intact and positioned on the high ground. What followed was some of the costliest fighting of the entire war. Soviet infantry attacked uphill against prepared defenses. German artillery, firing from reverse slopes where Soviet counter-battery fire couldn't reach them, inflicted terrible casualties. Soviet tanks bogged down in the marshy ground at the base of the heights or were destroyed by German anti-tank weapons firing from concealed positions. Zhukov, watching the attack stall, committed his armored reserves earlier than planned, a decision that would prove costly. The tanks, committed before the heights were secured, became tangled with the infantry in the congested battlefield. Traffic jams developed. Units lost cohesion. German defenders, firing from the heights, picked off Soviet tanks and assault guns. For 3 days, April 16th, 17, and 18, the battle for Seelow Heights raged. Soviet forces attacked repeatedly, suffering enormous casualties. Entire regiments were reduced to company strength. Tanks were destroyed by the dozens. But Soviet strength was inexhaustible. Fresh divisions were fed into the battle. Artillery continuously pounded German positions. And slowly, yard by yard, Soviet forces pushed up the heights. German casualties were also catastrophic. Many defenders were Volkssturm, inadequately trained, poorly equipped, terrified. They fought from fixed positions they couldn't leave without being shot by SS troops enforcing Hitler's no-retreat orders. When Soviet forces finally overran positions, they found elderly men and boys among the dead. To the south, Marshal Kohn's forces achieved faster success. Attacking across the Neisse River on April 16th, Kohn's armies broke through German defenses more rapidly than Zhukov's forces to the north. By April 18th, Kohn's tank armies were racing northwest, threatening to encircle German forces defending the approaches to Berlin. Kohn, seeing Zhukov bogged down at Seelow Heights, saw his opportunity. He requested permission from Stalin to turn his advance northward toward Berlin, effectively entering Zhukov's sector. Stalin, still playing his marshals against each other, approved. The race to Berlin was on. By April 19th, Soviet forces finally secured Seelow Heights. The cost had been staggering. Estimates suggest 30,000 Soviet casualties in just 3 days. But the main German defensive line had been broken. The road to Berlin was open. And now Soviet armored spearheads began their final drive toward the capital. German forces, exhausted and depleted, attempted to establish defensive lines closer to Berlin, but Soviet momentum was unstoppable. Tank armies bypassed strongpoints, leaving them to be reduced by following infantry. The focus was speed, reach Berlin before the other Soviet front, before any potential Western Allied move, before German forces could establish coherent defenses. As Soviet forces pushed toward Berlin from the east and southeast, they also began encircling the city. By April 21st, the first Soviet artillery shells began falling on Berlin's eastern suburbs. By April 23rd, Soviet forces had encircled Berlin completely, cutting it off from the outside world. Inside the pocket were approximately 1 million people, 300,000 German troops of varying quality, plus 700,000 civilians who had not or could not evacuate. The city was now a fortress under siege, with Soviet armies pressing in from all sides. 3 Soviet fronts were now closing on Berlin, Zhukov's from the east, Kohn's from the south, and Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front from the north. The plan was systematic destruction. Artillery would pound the city into rubble, air strikes would destroy anything still standing, and then infantry would fight through the ruins, building by building, room by room, until all resistance ceased. Inside Berlin, the atmosphere was apocalyptic. The city that had been the heart of Nazi power, the site of massive rallies and torchlit parades, was now a target. Air raids, British by night, American by day, had already destroyed much of the city. Now Soviet artillery added to the destruction. Shells fell randomly on residential neighborhoods, government buildings, historical landmarks. Civilians huddled in cellars and subway stations, emerging only to search for food or water. Many had not eaten properly in days. Water supplies were disrupted. Electricity was sporadic. And over everything hung the knowledge that the Soviet army, whose countrymen had suffered unspeakable atrocities at German hands, was coming for revenge. Some Berliners attempted to flee, but most roads were cut. Some committed suicide rather than face Soviet occupation. Others simply waited, praying that Western Allied forces might arrive first, believing, incorrectly, that the Americans or British would be more merciful conquerors than the Soviets. German military authorities attempted to organize the defense, but chaos reigned. Orders came from the Führerbunker that bore no relation to reality. Units that existed only on paper were ordered to counterattack. The Volkssturm was sent to defend positions with inadequate weapons and no hope of reinforcement. And SS squads roamed the streets, hanging anyone suspected of defeatism from lampposts with signs around their necks. "I was too cowardly to defend the Führer." By April 25th, Soviet forces had penetrated Berlin's outer defenses and were fighting in the city proper. The battle was entering its final, most terrible phase. No longer a battle of maneuver and breakthrough, Berlin would be a street fight, the kind of urban combat that favored defenders, that consumed armies, that turned a city into a charnel house. Soviet commanders divided Berlin into sectors and assigned them to specific armies. Each army would fight toward the center, toward the Reichstag, the parliament building that had become a symbol of Nazi power, and toward the chancellery and the Führerbunker beneath it. The goal was clear: capture these symbols of Nazi Germany, raise the Soviet flag over them, and end the war. But between the Soviet armies and those objectives lay a city of 4 million people, reduced now to rubble and defended by fanatical SS troops, terrified Volkssturm, and desperate soldiers who knew that surrender meant years in Soviet captivity. The battle for Berlin would be fought house by house, room by room, in conditions of almost unimaginable brutality. And at its center, in his underground bunker, Adolf Hitler would spend his final days raging against reality until reality consumed him. The fighting in Berlin was unlike anything Soviet forces had experienced. They had fought in cities before: Stalingrad, Warsaw, Budapest, but Berlin was the capital of their mortal enemy, and its capture had to be total, symbolic, final. Soviet tactics were brutal and effective. Artillery was brought forward to fire over open sights at buildings suspected of harboring defenders. 122mm and 152mm guns would be positioned at the end of streets and fire directly at buildings, sometimes from ranges of just a few hundred meters, blasting holes through walls and collapsing entire structures. Infantry advanced in small assault groups, storm groups, typically consisting of a squad of riflemen supported by engineers with flamethrowers and explosives, plus a tank or self-propelled gun for direct fire support. These groups would advance from building to building, clearing each structure before moving to the next. The procedure was methodical and devastating: blast a hole in the outer wall with a tank gun or artillery, throw grenades through the opening, spray the interior with submachine gun fire, then send in assault troops with flamethrowers to burn out any remaining defenders. Move to the next building and repeat. Berlin's buildings provided both cover and concealment for defenders. German troops, SS, Wehrmacht regulars, even Volkssturm, would position themselves on upper floors, in cellars, behind improvised barricades. A single building could hold up a Soviet advance for hours or even days. The subway system, the U-Bahn and S-Bahn, became battlegrounds. Tunnels connected different parts of the city, allowing defenders to move unseen and to attack Soviet forces from unexpected directions. Soviet forces would sometimes flood sections of the subway to prevent their use, drowning German soldiers and civilians sheltering below in the dark. Certain locations became focal points of the battle. The Reichstag, the German parliament building, stood near the center of the government district. Though it had not been used for governmental purposes since the 1933 fire that Hitler had used to consolidate power, it remained a powerful symbol. Soviet commanders designated it as the primary objective. Raising the Soviet flag over the Reichstag would symbolize the final Soviet victory. But the Reichstag was heavily defended. SS troops and Wehrmacht soldiers had fortified it, positioning machine guns in the windows, establishing firing positions in the ruins. The approaches were mined and covered by fire from nearby buildings. The assault on the Reichstag began on April 29th. Soviet forces attacked repeatedly, suffering heavy casualties in the open ground around the building. Artillery pounded the structure, which was already heavily damaged from previous bombing. Slowly, Soviet troops fought their way closer, clearing surrounding buildings, eliminating defensive positions one by one. On the night of April 30th, assault troops from the 150th Rifle Division finally fought their way into the Reichstag building and began the room-by-room clearance. The fighting continued into May 1st, hand-to-hand combat in smoke-filled corridors, grenades thrown through doorways, defenders fighting until they ran out of ammunition or were killed. Late on April 30th or early May 1st, accounts vary, Soviet soldiers Mikhail Yegorov and Melityn Kanteria fought their way to the roof of the Reichstag and raised the Soviet flag. The famous photograph, taken later and staged for better composition, showed the hammer and sickle flying over the shattered building. The image was immediately distributed throughout the Soviet Union and the world. The Reichstag had fallen, Berlin was doomed, Nazi Germany was finished. Not far from the Reichstag stood the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's headquarters. And beneath it, 50 feet underground, lay the Führerbunker where Hitler spent his final days. Hitler's routine in those final days was a travesty of normal leadership. He held daily conferences where he moved phantom armies on maps, ordering counterattacks from divisions that no longer existed. He raged at his generals for failing him. He blamed treachery for Germany's defeat while refusing to acknowledge his own catastrophic decisions. But reality was intruding even into the bunker. The constant vibration of Soviet artillery shells. The reports of Soviet forces fighting just blocks away. The knowledge that escape was no longer possible. And Hitler, for all his delusions, understood that the end had come. On April 29th, with Soviet forces closing in on the Chancellery, Hitler married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, in a brief civil ceremony in the bunker. That night, he dictated his last will and testament, a document that blamed everyone but himself for Germany's defeat and expelled Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler from the Nazi Party for attempting to negotiate with the Allies. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops were fighting their way into the Reichstag just a few hundred meters away, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. He shot himself in the head while simultaneously biting a cyanide capsule. Eva Braun took poison. Their bodies were carried up to the Chancellery garden, doused with gasoline, and burned while Soviet shells fell around the area. The man who had started the most destructive war in human history, who had ordered the genocide of 6 million Jews and millions of others, who had brought death and suffering to tens of millions, had taken the coward's way out, killing himself rather than facing justice for his crimes. Hitler's death was kept secret from most Germans for several days. Admiral Karl Donitz, named as Hitler's successor, was informed and immediately began attempting to negotiate a surrender to the Western Allies while continuing to fight the Soviets, a strategy the Allies rejected. The war would end with unconditional surrender to all Allied powers, not selective capitulation. In the bunker, those who remained faced difficult choices. Some attempted to break out through Soviet lines, most were killed or captured. Others committed suicide. Some simply waited to be captured, knowing their role in the Nazi regime meant they would face trial. But while Hitler was dead, the battle for Berlin continued. German defenders, many unaware of Hitler's death, continued fighting. Some fought from loyalty to a dead Führer. Others fought from fear of Soviet retribution. Still others fought simply because surrender seemed as dangerous as fighting. Soviet troops were not always accepting surrenders, and summary executions of SS troops and Nazi officials were common. On May 1st, General Hans Krebs, the last chief of the German General Staff, attempted to negotiate a surrender with Soviet commanders. But he sought terms, a ceasefire, negotiations, anything other than unconditional surrender. The Soviets refused. Unconditional surrender or the battle would continue until every German soldier was dead or captured. That same day, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister who had remained in the bunker, poisoned his 6 children and then had himself and his wife shot by an SS guard. The Nazi leadership was disintegrating through suicide and capture. Finally, on May 2, 1945, General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the Berlin defense area, decided to end the pointless slaughter. He ordered his forces to cease fire and surrender to Soviet forces. The order was broadcast by radio and transmitted through whatever communication lines still functioned. Some units surrendered immediately, gratefully. Others fought on for hours more, either not receiving the order or refusing to accept it. But gradually, throughout May 2nd, the firing died down. White flags appeared on buildings. German soldiers emerged from cellars and bunkers, hands raised, exhausted, defeated. The formal surrender document was signed at approximately 6 a.m. on May 2nd. General Weidling was taken to Soviet headquarters and ordered to sign. He complied. The Battle of Berlin was officially over. But the scenes in the city were apocalyptic. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Bodies, soldiers and civilians, lay in the streets, buried in collapsed buildings, floating in the canals. Fires still burned in many areas. The stench of death and destruction hung over everything. For Soviet soldiers, the victory was both triumphant and terrible. They had defeated the enemy that had invaded their country, destroyed their cities, killed millions of their countrymen. The raising of the flag over the Reichstag, the capture of Berlin, the final destruction of Nazi military power, all of this was vindication for 4 years of the most brutal warfare imaginable. But the victory came at an enormous cost. And what followed in Berlin, the widespread looting, the violence against civilians, particularly the mass rapes of German women by Soviet soldiers, would leave scars that would last generations. The fall of Berlin did not quite end the war in Europe. German forces in other theaters continued fighting for several more days. But Berlin's fall made further resistance meaningless. On May 7th, at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France, German representatives signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. On May 8th, Victory in Europe Day, the surrender was ratified in Berlin in a ceremony attended by representatives of all 4 major Allied powers. The Third Reich, which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, had lasted 12. It had brought the world to war, committed genocide on an industrial scale, and left Europe in ruins. And it had ended in the ruins of its own capital, with its leader dead by his own hand, its armies destroyed, and its surviving population facing an uncertain future under occupation. But the full cost of the Battle of Berlin, in lives, in destruction, in human suffering, was only now becoming clear. And the political consequences of who had captured Berlin and how would shape Europe for the next half-century. The casualty figures from the Battle of Berlin are difficult to calculate with precision, but their scale is undeniable. Soviet forces suffered approximately 80,000 killed and 280,000 wounded in the Berlin operation, casualties comparable to a major battle earlier in the war, compressed into just 16 days. Tank losses exceeded 2,000. The price of victory had been extraordinarily high. German military casualties were equally devastating, approximately 80,000 to 100,000 killed, 220,000 wounded, and over 480,000 captured. But these figures include only military personnel. German civilian casualties in Berlin are estimated at 100,000 to 125,000 killed during the battle, many from artillery fire and bombing, others from starvation, disease, or violence in the battle's aftermath. The physical destruction of Berlin was nearly total. 70% of the city's buildings were damaged or destroyed. Entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist, reduced to piles of rubble and twisted steel. The city's infrastructure was devastated: water, electricity, gas, sewage systems all non-functional. Transportation was impossible, streets were blocked with debris, bridges were destroyed, the railway system was wrecked. And scattered throughout this wasteland were the dead, tens of thousands of bodies that would take weeks to recover and bury. Mass graves were dug. Bodies were burned where they lay. The stench of death hung over the city throughout the summer of 1945. For Berlin's surviving civilian population, approximately 2.5 million people, the end of the battle brought not relief but new terrors. Soviet soldiers, after 4 years of brutal warfare, after witnessing what German forces had done in the Soviet Union, exacted revenge. The mass rapes of German women by Soviet soldiers in Berlin and throughout Eastern Germany remain one of the war's great atrocities. Estimates vary enormously, from tens of thousands to over 2 million German women assaulted during the Soviet occupation. The exact number will never be known, but the trauma was widespread and devastating. Soviet commanders, when they acted at all, did so inconsistently. Some units were disciplined. Others were allowed to run wild. The official Soviet position was denial. These crimes were not acknowledged, not prosecuted, not even discussed until decades later. But beyond the human suffering, the Battle of Berlin had profound strategic and political consequences. First, it established Soviet control over Eastern Germany and much of Eastern Europe. The territories occupied by Soviet forces at war's end would become the Soviet sphere of influence, eventually crystallizing into the Warsaw Pact and the division of Europe that would last until 1989. The division of Germany itself into Soviet, American, British, and French occupation zones was formalized at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. Berlin, though deep within the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4 sectors. This division, intended to be temporary, would become permanent with the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. The Battle of Berlin also represented the culmination of the Soviet Union's enormous contribution to Allied victory in Europe. The Soviet Union had borne the brunt of German military power for 4 years. Of the approximately 5 million German military deaths during World War II, over 4 million occurred on the Eastern Front. The Western Allies' campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe, while important, were secondary theaters compared to the titanic struggle in the East. By capturing Berlin, by raising the Soviet flag over the Reichstag, the Soviet Union announced to the world its status as a great power and its right to determine the post-war order in Eastern Europe. This assertion would lead directly to the Cold War, the decades-long confrontation between the Soviet bloc and the Western democracies. The Battle of Berlin also marked the end of the most destructive conflict in human history. World War II claimed approximately 70 to 85 million lives, over 3% of the world's population. Of these, the Soviet Union alone lost 27 million, nearly 14% of its pre-war population. Germany lost 7 million. Poland lost 6 million, half of them Jewish victims of the Holocaust. The war left Europe in ruins. Entire cities had been destroyed. Economies had collapsed. Millions were homeless, stateless, displaced. The political map had been redrawn. Colonial empires were beginning their collapse. On May 2nd, the garrison of Berlin surrendered. Adolf Hitler was already dead, having taken his own life in the bunker, leaving his capital to the overwhelming power of the Red Army. The cost was staggering: a city utterly destroyed, hundreds of thousands killed, and an entire nation laid bare. The Battle of Berlin formally ended the war on the Eastern Front, paving the way for the total surrender of Germany 6 days later. It was a victory forged in blood and fire, securing Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe and irrevocably establishing the geopolitical lines of the subsequent Cold War. The final, terrible scene of World War II in Europe remains the defining symbol of the Third Reich's ultimate, apocalyptic collapse. If you want to understand the monumental forces that shatter empires and define the end of eras, make sure you subscribe to History of Conflicts. Hit that notification bell and leave a comment below. We want to know, do you believe Marshal Zhukov's costly frontal assault on the Silo Heights was strategically necessary, or did the competition with Koniev lead to unnecessary bloodshed? Thanks for watching.